Hey, I wanted to review some of the main points from this week, the Tuesday the 15th and Thursday the 17th of October. So we were talking about ADHD, and we talked about, I guess, norepinephrine quite a bit, and as well as dopamine. One thing that we introduced in terms of this was with norepinephrine and dopamine, in addition to having postsynaptic receptors after they bind to the receptors and get sucked back into the terminal, there are two enzymes, COMT and MAO, and both of these enzymes will inactivate the norepinephrine, and this slows down transmission. The same thing happens with dopamine. And then also something similar happens with serotonin, although serotonin is not a catecholamine, it's just a monoamine, and so only MAO works on that. So serotonin is a monoamine, it's a type of monoamine, but it's not a catecholamine. Dopamine is a monoamine, and it's also a catecholamine. It belongs to both families of molecules, and norepinephrine also belongs to the family of monoamines as well as the subfamily of catecholamines. In terms of ADHD risk alleles, we talked about both on Tuesday and today that a lot of ADHD risk, that some ADHD risk alleles are involved with increasing dopamine. Yeah, so a lot of ADHD risk alleles increase, a lot of ADHD risk alleles decrease dopamine, and then even more, we don't know what they do, but a small number increase dopamine, and that's a little bit confusing. We brainstormed today a little bit about, how that could be, that some risk alleles might decrease dopamine, or might increase dopamine, but this is ultimately something that, while it's a paradox, it doesn't make sense. At first glance, there are some theories about why it might be. But those theories are, at least we know, are partially incomplete, and a lot of them are lacking experimental evidence. In terms of treatments for ADHD, today we talked about Ritalin, which is a dopamine transporter blocker. It's referred to as a stimulant because dopamine is involved in stimulating alertness and awakeness, and also increasing urges to move. Although, interestingly, in ADHD patients, this stimulant, Ritalin, often leads to decrease in hyperactive behavior and urges to move. A different medication, referred to as a non-stimulant, is a more recently developed one called atomoxetine. That's a norepinephrine transporter blocker and increases norepinephrine. There's some hope that these might actually treat different subtypes, but so far, at least when we look one gene at a time, there's not a clear link between one particular genetic risk factor and the effectiveness of one treatment versus the other. Although looking at combinations of genes might yield more information. Also looking at people with different brain structural differences within ADHD, or brain activity differences within ADHD, might give us some insight as well. That is ongoing work, as Maya talked about in the biomarkers class period. We reviewed the dopamine receptor classes. There's D1, which are stimulatory, and G2, which are inhibitory. Interestingly, even though they have opposite effects at the cells, they generally always have the same effect behaviorally. In the striatum, they always increase movement, and this is something that is, I know, very confusing, but dopamine inhibits action potentials in the stop neurons. Now, when the stop neurons do fire action potentials, they don't release dopamine. But when they receive dopamine, they stop firing action potentials, and then you've stopped the inhibition. That is a confusing thing, but definitely something that you should know for the exam. Norepinephrine receptors, on the other hand, have actually some sort of different effects, both cellularly and in terms of behavior. So one of the effects of norepinephrine, one of the receptors is a GQ associated or GO associated receptor. These can have complicated and mixed feelings with the cell, with mixed effects with the cell, but for the organism generally lead to, when these are overactivated, feeling overstimulated and overwhelmed, and actually are associated more with depression and anxiety, and don't seem to have much of a role in ADHD. With alpha-2 receptors, they have a calming effect. They're inhibitory. They have a calming effect. That actually has some antidepressant effects, but also is involved in sort of focused and calm attention. And the beta receptors also have some attentional effects. These are stimulatory, but also have some associations with activating stress, fight or flight responses, and so on. As we talked about, COMT and MAO slows down the recycling of dopamine and norepinephrine, and MAO slows down the recycling of just serotonin. And so serotonin synapses, you're not going to find COMT there because it's not going to be effective. Just monoamine oxidase is there. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors increase the amount of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And we'll return to those a little bit when we talk about depression and depression treatments. So we talked about specific risk alleles for ADHD that I've sort of already mentioned. Interestingly, either overactive or underactive COMT, as well as underactive dopamine receptors. And then in terms of the overactive or underactive COMT, there's over here this one idea that maybe there's sort of normal amounts of dopamine, and then a little bit of an increase leads to problems, but more of an increase actually can rectify those problems. That is an interesting hypothesis. That has some experimental data behind it, but that data has been also very controversial, and there's not a clear consensus about whether this is really the case or not. So what you should understand is sort of like why it's a little bit paradoxical, and have some ideas about one or two potential reasons why a brain with more dopamine might actually do even better if dopamine is further increased. The last thing that we talked about today is the Sobel study. In that study, they asked two questions. The first is just looking for physical anatomical differences in brains of people with ADHD versus controls. And so the first comparison they did is comparing unmedicated ADHD brains versus controls, looking at the sizes of various brain structures. And what they found is that the putamen, which is part of the striatum, is smaller in brains with unmedicated ADHD. There are a number of possible interpretations of this. One is that maybe there's some developmental change early in the brain that causes the putamen to get small, and that might cause ADHD or be somehow other correlated with ADHD. Or maybe the fact that going through their teenage years with the wrong amount of dopamine in their brain, wrong is too strong a word, a different amount of dopamine than controls in their brain might lead to the putamen getting smaller. They then did a second comparison, looking at brains, added an extra group, people with ADHD who had medication, stimulants that they were taking and that they had been taking for several years. And then again measured the size of the putamen. What they found is that in those patients with medication, their putamen is larger than the putamen of people with ADHD who didn't take medication, and also pretty similar to the size of the putamen in control subjects. The interpretation of this is that first of all, that enhancing dopamine in an ADHD brain will help to sort of make the putamen grow larger. And it seems to indicate that, back to our previous question from the same paper, that maybe there's not some sort of permanent change that happens in the brain to make it smaller in people with ADHD, or that smaller putamen is causing ADHD, but it's really that the altered dopamine and the leaving the brain throughout adolescence with an altered amount of dopamine causes a physical change in the brain structure. And if the dopamine amount is brought into a more appropriate level, that can lead to changes and sort of restoration of a more typical size putamen. This study, as a lot of studies, has some controversy and some criticisms associated with it. One of the main ones, which is true of basically all human studies, is that it's not really experimental. It's just observational and correlational, and it may be that there's just a difference in the different people with ADHD are not randomly choosing whether or not to take medication. And so there may be some systematic difference or some average difference between the people who choose to take medication versus those who don't. It has nothing to do with a consequence of the medication, but instead is correlated with some other aspect of their choice to take medication or not. So that's the last little bit that you need to know for the exam, and then we'll talk a little bit more about ADHD and one other study that will not be on Thursday's exam on Tuesday, and then move on to talking about depression as our next topic.